So today I was reminiscing about the 1990s and the early 2000s when I was growing up. And yeah, I know, the feeling of getting old. I am nearly 30 years old, actually. I will be turning 30 in September. And truly, the millennials are becoming the boomers of the future. The Zoomers already hate us, and pretty soon the Alphas are probably going to hate us even more. Uh, you're already seeing that sort of generational hatred on the internet. But I was thinking about those times, the 1990s and the 2010s, and I remember malls being packed full of people, full of people. Remember how you would go to a mall in, I don't know, 1998, 2005, 2004, 2003? The malls were packed full of people. And then you would go to the mall during the holiday season. And of course, they would have that giant Christmas tree, and it was just packed full of people, and Christmas carols were playing. People were drinking coffee and hot chocolate, and I know I'm glamorizing the recent past. Back in my day, malls were packed, though. Generally speaking, malls were packed full of people. It was a thing to do, especially on a Friday afternoon or on a Friday night. The mall was a cool place to go, unless, of course, you lived in kind of a questionable part of town and the people in the mall weren't that nice. But even so, the mall, generally speaking, was a cool place. And I remember going into the mall, and you would always see, remember how you would see the big posters of the Warhammer little figurines? Remember Warhammer? They still have that, actually. But I remember going to the mall, the Sun Valley Mall in Concord, California, to be specific, and you would see the Warhammer store, and then of course you would have like Hot Topic nearby, and you could smell the aroma of burning black leather. And then, you know, if you kept walking forward, eventually you would smell the delicious aroma of sugar and cinnamon coming from the apple pies of McDonald's, the glorious bakery that was at McDonald's, better than any sort of pastry you would get in Paris or Italy. Ah, yes, McDonald's. And but anyway, you would go to the Warhammer store. I never went into that store, but you would see it right from a distance, and then you would see the posters of the Warhammer characters, and you would see the figurines, and it was packed full of people. Nowadays, you go into a mall and there's no one there, right? Except for a few people here and there. Malls are dying. Malls are endangered. And that's because, of course, of online shopping. But a mall used to be a cool place to go. Now it's almost near extinct. Well, this has nothing to do with the main topic that I want to bring up in this video, but I was simply just reminiscing on the past because it is a cool topic to bring up. But there is something that I remember that does have a connection with what is currently taking place in modern day political discourse. Not just that, but what trends, what sort of ideological and political trends that we are currently witnessing. I remember Warhammer, right? A lot of nerds used to play Warhammer, and they would play Warhammer after school. And I remember people would play video games, online games, on PC. This is before Xbox Live. And they would play the PC games. And there was a video game, it was called Combat Flight Simulator. It was a very popular game, and people would pick their fighter plane or their fighter jet from World War II, and they would battle it out online. And it was a fun game, but what I didn't know was that there were a lot of ideological weirdos that would play these games, just like there were a lot of ideological weirdos who would play Warhammer, and these people still exist today. But I remember I had a friend who loved playing this game, And one time we were in Burger King, and as we were eating, he was telling me about how when he plays this combat flight simulator game, he noticed that there were Nazis that were playing this game, and that there were people who would get online to play this game, and they would pick the planes from the Third Reich, and they would LARP as Nazis online on this game. And as they were fighting the Americans or the British or some allied air force, they would scream Nazi slogans, and they would say, Heil Hitler, or, God bless the Third Reich, or the Third Reich will rise again. And I remember he was telling me these things, and I was shocked. And because in my mind, Nazis were absolutely evil, and of course they are. And it was unfathomable to me that somebody would want to even fantasize in a video game about being a Nazi. But he was telling me about this, and he was informing me on it, and he was informing me on something that I didn't know was existing. And that was the phenomena of people who LARP as Nazis in nerd activities. Recently, there was a story that came out about a guy who is really big in the Warhammer game. Now, for those of you who don't know, Warhammer is a game where you take little figurines and you LARP as these characters. I really don't know the details of the game, but it's some sort of a game involving fantasy and gargoyles and monsters and people dressed up like Vikings. But anyway, there was a guy, his name is Arch Warhammer, and he is a Warhammer player on YouTube, and he has quite a following on YouTube as a Warhammer enthusiast. And he recently came out as a Nazi. Not only did he come out as a Nazi, but he was also saying some very perverted things about children. I won't get into that, but you get the idea of what I'm talking about. Very perverted stuff. But he also came out as a Nazi, and he praised the Christchurch shooter, and he calls himself Arch Warhammer. And what things like this reveal is how a lot of modern-day Nazism is found in LARPing activities and nerd activities, what we consider nerd activities. You can also see these types of people in so-called neo-folk activities, neo-folk festivals. Basically, people getting together, LARPing as medieval characters. The women dress up like they're in some sort of a soap opera where people pretend to be medieval characters. The women basically look like public school teachers on a Halloween afternoon. And then you have the men who are LARPing as knights or wizards, and they look like they just got out of a Lord of the Rings movie. But you find ideological weirdos in these sorts of circles. Another thing that I remember from the past, from the early 2000s, was a guy that I knew. He was someone who lived near my neighborhood where I grew up in the Bay Area. And he was a very, very big guy. Big. You know how he didn't lift weights or anything. You know how some people are just born big. They're just big boned people. That was this guy. In fact, I remember he would go to the grocery store and he would buy a giant jug, like those 1 gallon jugs of chocolate milk. And he would just walk around with it, drinking it. And he was just a really, really big guy. Calcium filled, big boned guy. But he was very funny. But ideologically, he was very deceived, ideologically very twisted person. His mother was a big environmentalist, so obviously, inevitably, he would have very warped views of the world. Well, I remember one time we were in the car and we were driving. I wasn't driving, but we were in a car, and he was in one of the back seats. And I remember he said something that was so weird to me. And at that point, I had never heard anyone say what he was about to say. And mind you, this boy was in the 6th grade. And he said, "I think we should kill all of the rich." This was my introduction to Marxism. He said, "I think we should kill all of the rich. The rich are the source of all evil." So looking back and reminiscing on the guy who wants to murder all the rich and revive the French Revolution and start a new Bolshevik revolt, and the kids who played video games LARPing as Nazis, one thing that I think we can say with much certainty is that a lot of the weird political views that we have been seeing trending currently, be it fanatic left-wing ideology or fanatic right-wing ideology, a lot of these things were germinating in the 1990s and obviously before. But a lot of these things were germinating in my generation in the 1990s because Gen X, well, I don't think there were a lot of socialists and Nazis or people who sympathized with the Soviet Union or the Third Reich amongst the Gen X generation. The Gen X generation were more of the types of people who would play golf or tennis on a Sunday afternoon and talk about the stock market. The same thing can be said for the boomers. But with my generation, we began to see the shift. Look at people like Richard Spencer. These are younger people. I think Richard Spencer is in the oldest of the millennial generation, but you begin to see it. And you're starting to see it come harder from the Zoomers and people who are younger than me. I look at, what's his name, Nick Fuentes and those types of people. And there have been some beliefs that people have had on the Zoomers that there is going to be a tremendous amount of nationalism amongst the Zoomers and the Generation Alphas. It's pretty disturbing. But a lot of these things were germinating in the 1990s. In fact, a lot of the geopolitical situations that we see today started out in the 1990s. For one thing, the fall of the Soviet Union was in the 1990s. What did the fall of the Soviet Union lead to? Well, it helped accelerate the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. So you have that. And the other thing that we saw in the 1990s was the utter destruction of Yugoslavia. What did that do? It bolstered up Croatian nationalism, Serbian nationalism, Albanian, Kosovo nationalism, all that stuff in that area. And this would be really the beginning of the fragmentation of Europe, because the Balkans is still Europe. I know that a lot of people, or at least some people, like to see the Balkans as sort of kind of like the Middle East, but it's part of Europe. And so the beginning of the fragmentation of Europe begins in the Balkans, and that happened in the 1990s. And then in the early 2000s, we saw the Iraq War, which accelerated a tremendous migrant crisis. In fact, a lot of America's destructive foreign policies were enabled because of the fall of the Soviet Union. Because remember what happened before the fall of the Soviet Union. You had two pegs of power that ran the world. You had the American Empire, and then you had the Soviet Empire. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the American Empire was enabled to do essentially what it wanted to do. Noam Chomsky has talked about this. Numerous other geopolitical analysts have talked about how the fall of the Soviet Union accelerated the rise of the American Empire and also the rise of American obstinance and arrogance against international law. And it gave the American Empire this feeling of empowerment that it could do what it wanted, and hence it bombed the hell out of Serbia and caused a tremendous amount of destruction for that country. And the United States did something that it would have had a lot more difficulty in doing if the Soviet Union was still alive. So you have that. And the migrant crisis eventually led to the nationalist phenomena that we are currently seeing. So a lot of these things that we are seeing today, a lot of it began in the 1990s and in the 2010s. And also the phenomena of tankies, the phenomena of Marxism, the phenomena of modern day communists, A lot of this stuff popped up in the 2010s. And remember, going back to that kid that I knew back in California, he said, let's kill all of the rich. Well, he didn't make that up. Somebody told him that. Somebody told him that. And what that really indicated was that such ideas were lingering about in the atmosphere. That now maybe that kid, he's obviously an adult now. Maybe he has changed. I don't know. Regardless, the fact still remains that such ideas were lingering about in the 1990s and people were inculcating these sentiments. Now, of course, you can say that these ideas were alive and well in the 1970s and 80s, and yeah, you'd be right. But who's pushing for communism today? It's not generally speaking, it's not the boomers, okay? It's a bunch of millennials and zoomers. The same thing can be said for the rise of National Socialism and fanatical ultra-nationalism. A lot of these people who are pushing these things are millennials. The guy who's running the Forum for Democracy Party in the Netherlands is not a boomer. He's a millennial. So a lot of the very, very diabolical things that we are seeing, the diabolical forces that we are seeing arising, a lot of these things began with my generation. A lot of these things were germinating within my generation. And this plant, or these plants, are only going to manifest very, very rotten and poisonous fruits. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.